Opposition to domestic violence is an important indicator of social progress and an essential requirement for harmonious families and a stable society.
China's two sessions have focused on legislation pertaining to people's well-being, with the anti-domestic violence law generating headlines and praise from women's rights groups worldwide. According to the All China Women's Federation, 1 in 4 married women have suffered violence in their marriage, and more than 40% of children faced abuse by their parents. This law is China's first national law against domestic violence and extends protections to female and male victims of violence and abuse across the country. Joining us now to analyze this new law from Beijing, Chen Tingting is the Asia Foundation's Program Officer for Women's Empowerment in China. Also from Beijing, Liu Huawen is a professor of international law at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Tingting, let me start with you. Tell us about this new law. How does it better protect victims of domestic violence in China?
The law gives a specific definition of domestic violence, and it also clarifies the responsibilities of various stakeholders, not just public institutions like the police, but also others which were not so much involved in the actions before, such as employers and the media, in terms of how they should step in to intervene domestic abuses. So these are all very important basics for the victims to know when they should reach out to seek help, and from what sources, and also for the abusers to understand when they will be violating the law. And secondly, the law also gives some guidance on concrete protective mechanisms, such as the reporting mechanism, which is meant to encourage more effective disclosure, not only by the victims themselves, but also by people around them and by public institutions. And there's also a restraining order, which will keep victims safe as they're seeking further help. But more operational details are needed in order to make the law effective in protecting victims. For example, how mandatory reporting of cases involving minors will work in conjunction with the child protection system, which is being built in China.
Professor Liu, this law has been a long time in the making. Pressure groups, women's rights groups, other rights groups have been pushing for this law for quite some time. Has there been resistance to it in some parts of China from some groups?
Actually, the new law was adopted after 2 readings. It seems everything went quite smoothly. The fact is, before this, a lot of preparations had been done. We note that equality between men and women for a long time had been our basic national policy. And the very first law adopted by People's Republic of China was marriage law with an aim to liberate women. So here in China, all of us, we know we support the basic principle of gender equality. But how to define it, how to understand it, how to update the standards of gender equality, that's the new challenge. Before the law was adopted, actually the draft was made public to welcome feedbacks from all the society. It's relevant to the whole society, to every family, so people care a lot. And there are many controversial issues. For example, how to define domestic violence, how to handle it, whether the public power could come in to intervene the family life.
Tingting, I was talking about those figures that I mentioned right at the beginning of the program. A quarter of Chinese women, 40% of Chinese children are victims of domestic violence. You know, when one thinks of Chinese families, we know that there is a great deal of emphasis which is put on stability in the family and the strength of the family unit in China. So what, in your view, is driving this kind of abuse right now in China?
It's really great that you point out the fact that domestic violence does not only affect women, it affects other populations, especially children, for example. And I think the fundamental of domestic abuse is one's desire to control another, either in an intimate relationship or in a parent-child relationship. And this is nothing unique to the Chinese culture. In the cases the Asia Foundation and our partners have worked on, it's not difficult to identify this pattern. Abuses occur when a husband or a partner is afraid of losing control of a woman who is very successful in her career, or when she fails to meet certain expectation, and men could get abused for similar reasons too. In the case of abuse against children, it's even more challenging, I think, because parents usually exercise a high level of discretion in disciplining their children. Beating a child could be easily accepted and tolerated in the name of the parent's goodwill. I think these are perceptions that will take even more efforts to adjust and change than just having a law. But it's very important and necessary to set boundaries and bottom lines by a law.
Professor Liu, when we look at the practical implementation of this law, Tingting mentioned a moment ago, one of the important components of this law is the fact that authorities would now be able to issue restraining orders against individuals or others who are responsible for this kind of domestic violence. How important is that development, that the fact that police, courts, other authorities can now issue these restraining orders?
Yes, I say it's just the first step of a long road, and the new law empowers so many actors to play their role against domestic violence. But I say it's the first step. We need further detailed rules, and we need supplementary law or policies to realize the law. In my eyes, domestic violence is not just a legal issue. In some sense, it's easier to have the law, but more difficult to implement it. And so we need to change people's mind, the social culture, and we need to have some social mechanism to realize, to enforce the law. For example, the law mentioned the temporary shelters for the victims of domestic violence, but even in big cities, we do not have a sound establishment of the shelters, let alone the remote area, the countryside. So there are still many challenges.
Tingting, it's of course one thing to have a law, it's another thing to make sure that people are aware that these laws exist and that they are there to protect them. What is being done to make people aware of these new laws? And one other important thing is, are there any programs at preventive intervention to stop these abusive behaviors starting in the first place?
Mm-hmm. I think, in my opinion, there are two different aspects that to be covered by public education, as you mentioned, which is a very important way of preventing violence from happening. The first dimension of public education would be to educate the public on the law, what behaviors constitute domestic violence, what legal consequences would entail, and how victims could seek help. In fact, the new law emphasized quite a lot on how different stakeholders should take the responsibility to roll out public education programs, including how the media should take their responsibility. And another dimension, which I think is more fundamental in terms of preventing, is to adjust to tackle the issue of gender inequality, as Professor Liu earlier mentioned. And this is because the fundamental causes is the unequal gender powers between individuals. And in the case of abuse against children, is the unequal relationship or the parents' the perception of seeing beating a child as an acceptable way of disciplining. So changing these perceptions should be another very important dimension to be tackled by public education. In the Asian Foundation's program in other countries, we also work to identify risk factors such as alcoholism, which is contributing to the frequency of abuses. So addressing these risk factors would also help to prevent violence from escalating. So we really look forward to replicating these valuable practices into China in the upcoming years.
Right, so it'll need a very comprehensive approach. Professor Liu, what is your assessment of how far the government is moving in the area of women's rights in China? And I mentioned specifically women's rights because we do know that most of the victims of this kind of domestic violence are women.
Yes, anti-domestic violence is a big challenge around the world, actually. And in my eyes, we should activate different members of the society. As I said, it relates to every family, the whole society. So we are relevant and we care. And before the law was adopted, scholars, judges, lawyers, social activists, they contributed a lot. There are so many discussions, and we try to show to the society that domestic violence is not a family issue, it's a legal issue. It relates to rights of women, children, and other persons. And the very basis of family is love, is not other things. So domestic violence is not conducive to a harmonious relationship within the family. And it is about the dignity of women, children, and the family members. So we hope the new law could bring us the new culture, human rights-based culture, and give us the tools to be made use of against domestic violence.